hope this works for you now.
Yeah.
So basically, as you can already see in my first slide here, is I would like to give a direction, to give some answers on where can we find regulations on PFAS substances connected to PFAS on a global scale. And I hope I can answer most of the majority of the questions for today's call. If not, honestly, please feel free to send me an email, contact me afterwards. You can ask questions via the chat function or after the meeting. My presentation slides, there are no trade secrets, so I will share them, or at least I am sharing them with everyone after the meeting. So as I said already, TV Rheinland, we are coming from a different angle. So we have business streams which are in regards to automotive, mobility, like industrial service, academy life care systems, which then is so certification of management systems, and also we have products where I belong to, and we are focusing on basically product testing on a global scale, different types of products, and therefore I think it's one of our core businesses at the moment to provide test solutions and also somehow legal references to suppliers, to brands, to retailers, to manufacturers on a global scale, to provide a compliance testing program for them to achieve the regulatory goals, which are very, very demanding, I have to say. And this you will see also later in my presentation. And I think in the first part of this webinar, you already have seen a lot of information. Where can we find PFAS? What are PFAS? So basically, I just want to briefly give some points here. Is where can we find PFAS? And I think also these products, they are changing, they're coming new products, there's a substitution process of PFAS in the industry now. So there is a change, let's call it like this. However, I think the majority of products still remains the same. Heat resistant non-stick coatings, I think, are quite common here. Food packaging, especially if you have oily or greasy parts, stain resistant for textiles, and as well as carpets and home textiles are a huge problem in the indoor, ending in a huge problem for the industry if then PFAS are restricted. Cosmetic products also containing PFAS. Also Chivax, which in the end you might know last, I think it was 2 years ago, Olympics, where they have been restricted by the Olympic Committee that these kinds of products cannot be used anymore for, I think it was for skiing and for biathlon. Electronic industry, electroplating industry, they are using also PFAS in a quite high amount. And at the moment, maybe as you might quite be aware of it, they cannot replace it. Fire extinguishing foams, huge problem for the industry and also part of the majority of restrictions on a global scale. Also electrical industry, somehow the semiconductor industry and photographic processors. They are all using somehow PFAS substances. But where does it come from? So basically, it's the origin of this one is coming from 2000. Just give me 1 second. I'm working from home. As everyone can see now, maybe that's not the best example here, but yeah, working from home sometimes gives some challenges. So basically, it comes from the textile industry, where Greenpeace in 2011, 2012 did studies on the environmental impact on wastewater streams in the industry of textile processing. And what they found out, and that could be a quite good connection to the next presentation here, is that several compounds, especially and also including PFAS, because PFAS somehow considered to be so-called forever chemicals, and those forever chemicals, they do not degrade in the nature. So therefore you can find them in waste streams, you can find them in environmental testing. And based on the type of process in the textile industry, we can, and we did studies here with our laboratories, we can detect PFAS on a global scale. So it's not Asia, it's not only not China. You can also find it in European Union, in different processes where they are still part of production. So there are limitations for C8, C10, long chain substances. However, the industry is changing and now using different types of PFAS. When talking about the consumer product regulation, I think it's very clear that the European Union, with the existing regulations, is taking already a step forward to reduce, to substitute, and also to ban PFAS in different types of products. And looking at this overview, you can see there are different groups of PFAS which are restricted. I think the most common here is PFOA, PFOS, and now since this year, it's C9 to C14 PFCA, which are all types, different lengths, different carbon lengths of PFAS. Quite new here is the regulation for sulfonic acid with the C6 carbons coming from the Swiss regulation, which then also, by the way, will be implemented in the European law quite soon. However, there are existing regulations with somehow interestingly different limits. So there is no consistency between the limits. The limit for PFOA might be totally different than a limit for PFOS. So based on the different type of perfluorinated and polyfluorinated compounds, we as a testing institute have to provide different testing solutions, which makes it quite challenging as well to provide also a coverage of those existing regulations. Because if a product contains those chemicals, based on the application and also based on the definition, there are exemptions, by the way, these products are considered to be not marketable anymore. However, and then also the other part is, if I'm using somehow substances or mixtures, preparations which containing those to produce a product, this makes the product in the end also not marketable. So looking at this one, there are challenges in the industry to replace those chemicals. And also there's challenging for the test industry to provide an appropriate test assessment here. And just only to give you one example and to show you how complex it can be to provide sufficient testing is the existing entry 68 of REACH Annex 17. REACH as the European Chemical Regulation, Annex 17 is here the material restriction part, and entry 68 is previously reserved for PFOA, but then PFOA was shifted to the POP regulation, which is the persistent organic pollutant regulation, where I will have somehow an explanation later on. However, this entry for C9 to C14 PFCH, which is a specific group of PFAS, contains unique chemical substances with defined CAS numbers. So it's not a group restriction like test everything which is looking similar. So there are specific CAS numbers. However, based on the definition of related substances where you have kind of some, the industry now is looking into their own supply chain on which of those chemicals are intentionally used in products, are unintentional contaminations because of the low detection limits. Also, unintentional contaminations can be cause non-compliances. And here we're talking about ppb level. So the limit for PFCAs, C9 to C14, is the sum 25 ppb. For related substances, the limit is 260 ppb as a sum. And the more chemicals I'm adding here, the more complicated it will be also from a laboratory point of view, because it's not sufficient anymore to just only one method. At the moment, and that depends on the lab, and maybe I think the majority of you is very well aware of this, an LC method is not sufficient to cover the complete range of PFAS at the moment regulated. So there are different methods like GC needs to be included. Also, by more research, more speaking to customers, looking at existing chemicals on the market, there are also new chemicals which will be added on a frequent basis. So it's a living document, and the more the lab is looking into it, or the labs, it's just not only one lab, but the industry is looking into it, the more complex each individual regulation or legislation will be. So as you can see here, based on the definition, based on the available standards, also testing standards, we can make up, or we can create so-called restricted substances lists, which then include specific chemical substances with a unique CAS number. However, and that's something I have to say, and the majority of chemicals is not intentionally used in products. They are somehow a byproduct. And there are in let's describe it like this, there are an indicator of the usage of perfluorinated compounds, which then indicates the use of PFAS. So therefore, I think that's also then the initial stage is therefore the limit. The product limit is quite low because PFOA and PFAS are not intentionally used in products. They are a byproduct, they are an unintentional contamination, and therefore are an indicator of perfluorinated treatment. As I said already, and that's something very, very important here, is that it's a living process. And the longer people looking into it, the longer the European Union is looking into it, the more data are created, the more chemicals will be restricted. In 2022, the European Union issued the new plan for reducing toxic chemicals. So with this plan of a toxic-free environment, they call it, PFAS as forever chemicals are one big part of their existing research and also about their existing regulations. There are also other parts like endocrine disruptors, which are also a quite important research project of the European Union, of the ECHA at the moment. However, PFAS, because it's an ongoing topic for not only the authorities, but also for NGOs and also consumer, because the majority of the consumer in 5 or 10 years ago was not really well aware of what kind of chemicals are used in my product. People are getting now more interested in to know, okay, what are the chemicals I am consuming somehow, or what are the chemicals which are part of my products. So therefore, that's also what we as a testing institute can see. We have more requests also from authorities to somehow provide a feedback on what are the most common chemicals we can find, but also, and that's something which is driven by the European Union and also by the German authorities, it's the so-called the information duty about SVHCs, or as I showed you in the beginning, PFOA, PFAS, PFCA, C9, C14, they are all SVHC substances. So there is an information duty about distribution, about usage of SVHCs already existing since years in the European Union. However, that's not existing in the producing countries like China, Southeast Asia, India, EMEA region especially, where there are still challenges to replace those PFAS substances. And when doing the testing here, it's quite obviously for us that the industry is very, very, let's say it like this, it's very, very eager to replace those chemicals, but there are limitations for replacements because there are physical properties which are unique to PFAS. So therefore, to replace them, it will have a side effect here. And but it is necessary to take actions, and that's what I said in the beginning by Greenpeace. There are industry groups now which are working on those kinds of substitution substances. The industry itself, BASF, Huntsman, 3M, they're also working on different solutions here to provide PFAS-free chemicals which have a somehow similar physical characteristics as the existing ones. However, on the other hand side, and that's what here you can see, and I think that's a quite new regulation or a proposal here, is that the European Union, and especially the competent authorities, are working on let's call it total ban of pair and polyfluorinated compounds. Now they started with C8 chemistry, they go to C6 chemistry now, and that's in the end effect somehow the uses are limited to different types of applications. Theoretically, C4 chemicals, PFAS chemicals are still allowed. However, we might don't know if this will be regulated in the next phase, or maybe they will go directly to like similar like the United States, which is the next part, is to say, okay, we are prohibiting the usage of all kinds of PFAS in products, or at least establishing a reporting system. In 2022, the state of California has issued the first law or legislation to restrict PFAS in textiles and apparels, which is California AB 1817. At the same time, California also issued AB 1200, which addresses the usage of PFAS in packaging material. So especially looking at not only at California, but also at different other states, which are, I have to say, more like looking at the overview here, it's like East and West Coast, so more the democratic countries, or than the Republican countries or Republican states. They are issuing several laws to restrict PFAS and different types of products, different types of preparations. And at the moment we are looking at, as you can see, is around 102 adopted policies. The number sounds quite big. However, as I said, it's on a state level, and there are quite a lot of states. These policies, these laws are somehow similar. But what we can see here is that the United States especially is not looking at individual chemical substances like the European Union is with PFOA, PFAS. They are looking at the total ban of PFAS kind substances, which brings us then to the next point. And I don't want to talk about this point so much, is per definition, and here the United States or the California and the states of the individual states using the OECD definition of PFAS, which in the end means that everything which has a fluorinated carbon is somehow considered to be PFAS substances, which then brings somehow the question is, are they really all substances with the carbon atom and the fluorine compounds related to water repellency? No, they're not. Some of them, they are also reactive dyes. So basically, this will also then cover other chemicals than these kinds of PFAS substances, which when we are talking about PFAS, which have a unique water repellency, for example. And that's something which is very, very interesting to see, that some chemicals are also affected by those restrictions, by those policies, which maybe have not been in the first place thought about. And that's something which drives the industry at the moment. However, and we are as a testing consultancy industry, we are going here together with the industry to approach the stakeholders to convince them and to find solutions for testing. As we said, and I think that's what also part in the first beginning, 4,700 substances could be considered to be PFAS. If you go to a different database, it could be 9,000. So at the moment, and that's something, there are limitations for testing. There are limitations for getting sufficient standards, analytical standards. And the approach of the state regulations here is that they do total fluorine testing, total organic fluorine testing, which then gives the indication that is there a fluorine compound, yes or no. And that's at the moment the two big differences here. Germany, Europe, Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, they are looking at individual PFAS compounds. United States, on the other hand side, is looking at basically total fluorine and banning the complete usage, intentional use of PFAS in textiles, in shoes and apparels, and also in cosmetics, in other preparations like fire aging foam. So therefore, there are existing or similar restrictions. However, different approach has different needs different solutions. When talking about the two main countries or the two main regions, Europe and United States, we should not forget that the initial or the proposal for the restriction of PFAS, PFOA, PFAS is not really initiated at the moment by the European Union, but it is initiated by the so-called Stockholm Convention of Persistent Organic Pollutants, which I said already in the beginning, the POP regulation. And Stockholm Convention is driving the implementation of new limits and new chemicals or chemical restrictions, and therefore has released, as I said already in the beginning, several laws under the POP regulations to restrict PFAS chemicals. One interesting part of the Stockholm Convention is we are not talking about countries located in Europe. The Stockholm Convention is a global impact, is a global kind of organization where different countries take part, joining, and also then enforcing requirements based on the recommendation of Stockholm Convention. So Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Thailand, for example. Australia also now planning. Canada, for example. United States, also part of this, are now implementing piece by piece the recommendations and also the limits from the Stockholm Convention into their national law. And that's something what we can see here is that it's not only Europe, also exists also restrictions applies to products when placing in Singapore, when placing in China now, as you can see here on my slide, in Japan. And within time, we see that it will end up in a total ban of PFAS, because if somehow the majority of countries and also the majority of producing countries are restricting the market or are restricting or affecting the marketability of chemical preparations, then those chemical preparations will not be used anymore in the production of products. And again, here also there is the connection to ZDHC, Zero Discharge of Hazard Chemicals, which is an industry group originated from the textile industry. They have a so-called MRS, Manufacturing Restricted Substances list, where they are restricting those kinds of PFAS or almost every kind of PFAS in chemical formulations used for the production of textiles. So again, as I said already, United States, and there are a lot of states in the here which have been established legal limits, which have been establishing disclosure requirements for the usage of PFAS. But now also the EPA realized that there might be a problem, there is a challenge, there is a certain risk. So also EPA now addresses those PFAS restrictions to be or to create somehow awareness, and also maybe in the near future restrict the usage of PFAS under TSCA. So with TSCA is somehow similar to the European REACH regulation. It's a chemical prohibition law applicable to the United States. So maybe sooner or later PFAS can also be part here, and then they are restricted in all types of applications and also all types of products. Good. Again, last slide is also then something for which I've already mentioned here. So there are also not, when talking about the European Union, these are not only restrictions for the usage and for the restrictions in products, but there are also restrictions for waste. So which means then also limits to then the limits of PFAS and PFOA, PFAS in this case, apply also to waste, which then is not just only the product level. So it's just like somehow circular economy approach where it said, don't use it in the production, don't buy it, and also please don't have it in outgoing waste here. And here, therefore, I think it's very, very important to look into this and also to see if my products are affected by this and how my products are affected to this and what can I do to replace those chemicals here. Good. This was the last slide of my presentation. Let me see. I can see that there have been 2 questions. Yes, I can share I think, Lionel, all the presentations will be shared after the meeting, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have questions